Good morning, everyone. Here's your Mormon news update for September 30th, 2024. We've got a lot to talk about today, and we are going to start with an article from unclosetedmedia.com that says, "Conversion therapy is a practice that aims to change the sexual orientation or gender identity of LGBTQ people. Countless studies have proven that conversion therapy does not work. A 2019 report from UCLA's Williams Institute found that those who went through conversion therapy were twice as likely to consider and attempt suicide than those who hadn't experienced it. And a 2018 study found that teens who experienced conversion therapy developed lower levels of self-esteem, social support, and life satisfaction, and lower levels of education and income in young adulthood. Since 2016, there have been a swath of headlines that illustrate how 23 states, including Kentucky earlier this month, have banned conversion therapy. This has led the public to believe that it's becoming less of a problem. But the truth is, these laws only apply to licensed psychologists who practice on children. That means it is still perfectly legal nationwide for religious leaders to practice conversion therapy on anyone of any age. The issue with this is that the majority of conversion therapy in the U.S. is administered by religious leaders, and this includes people in the Mormon Church. The Williams Institute estimates that while 16,000 LGBTQ youths ages 13 to 17 will receive conversion therapy from a licensed therapist before they turn 18, as many as 57,000 will receive it from a religious or spiritual advisor. They say it is an interference on freedom of religion and interference on freedom of speech, says Marie Amelie George, a professor of law at Wake Forest University who specializes in LGBTQ rights. Curtis Galloway, founder of Conversion Therapy Survivor Network, says because of this nuance, the law doesn't have much impact. 95% of people in the network would not fall under the protections of the laws that are in place. Almost 80 survivors in Galloway's network have reported going through conversion therapy, and many of them by religious leaders. One of the survivors in Galloway's network is 41-year-old Samuel Nieves, who grew up as a Mormon in Utah. "What hurt more than therapy was when my religious community would hurt me," says Nieves, an IT healthcare consultant who lives in Seattle. He remembers the church telling him being gay was a choice, and he needed to listen to country music, play football, and do more masculine things in order to correct himself. He says he was told to end his friendships with people who were accepting of homosexuality, and that he was publicly shamed for being queer by being forced to sit out communion and other sacred practices. Under pressure from his church, which was his main support system, Nieves internalized that something was wrong with him because he was gay, and, over the course of 2 years, sought conversion therapy from 5 different licensed therapists who claimed to heal homosexuality. Similarly to what was discussed at church, the therapist he was seeing 20 years ago through Brigham Young University student counseling, Michael Buxton, told him to go fishing with his dad and find a way to enjoy a Playboy magazine as treatment. Buxton told Uncloseted Media that he's very embarrassed that he might have said that, but it was a different time and people were begging him to cure them of homosexuality. In the last decade, conversion therapy of all forms has become more internationally condemned. As of December 2023, 14 countries banned the practice by any person, including religious leaders. Conversion therapy torture is still being practiced in the LDS Church, though, with groups like Affirmation and Beacon. To read the rest of the article and find ways that you can support people in the banning of conversion therapy, go to unclosetedmedia.com. And now we will go to an article from the BYU newspaper. It says, BYU's Neil A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship launched a scripture-focused lecture series on Thursday, September 19th, intended to exemplify disciple scholarship. The Wonder of Scripture lecture series seeks to bring light to the Maxwell Institute's efforts to inspire religious study and thought. Christian Heel, a senior research fellow at the Maxwell Institute and co-organizer of the upcoming lecture series, said he sees the series as a way to help students and faculty remove the dull regularity from scripture study and revitalize it with more care and focus. This lecture series is trying to model a kind of reading which will enrich our lives, Heel said. One thing we really tried to focus on was what is possible when we read scriptures carefully. Kimberly Matheson, the Laura F. Wills Research Fellow at the Institute and co-organizer of the lecture series, said the series is a way for joy and awe to be injected into the study of scripture. I think it's important that we're not forgetting that it's a marvelous marvelous work and a wonder, Matheson said. For Matheson, this lecture series reflects the BYU academic atmosphere. This is a place where I can study Scripture as Scripture, Matheson said. A place where the people on either side of me are believers, where I can commit to the reality of the words. Matheson will be giving a lecture as part of the series on December 6th, focused on her studies of Book of Mormon theology. Sharon Harris, Associate Professor of English at BYU, and another upcoming speaker on October 18th, said she feels the lecture series is a valuable and welcome addition to campus. We have only begun to scratch the surface of what the Book of Mormon can teach us as individuals, as a church, and across the world. It deserves our best efforts of mind and heart as part of a BYU education, Harris said. Additionally, Harris sees the value of Scripture study for individuals in their personal lives. The more I am immersed in diligent and faithful Scripture study, the better I treat others, Harris said. We all need that power in our lives. Because I constantly heard things like that when I was a believing Mormon, I read the Scriptures a lot. I actually read the Book of Mormon 8 times in the 2 years before I left the church. So I can with confidence say, here is a list of books that changed my life more than the Scriptures ever did. Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. Unbound by Tarana Burke. Boundaries by Cloud and Townsend. Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson. Every Book by Brené Brown. Complex PTSD From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. I will put a caveat on that one. The information was really good. The writing I did not think was very good. Every Book written by Glennon Doyle. Love and Logic by Jim and Charles Fay. Recovering Agency by Luna Lindsay Corbden. Combating Cult Mind Control by Steve Hassan, and so many more. Can you imagine what it would look like if Mormons spent as much time studying those kinds of books as they do studying the Book of Mormon and other Scripture? Now we will go to people.com for an article about another book. It says, retired criminal attorney and author Lori Vallow had just moved to Arizona when the news of the missing Daybell children emerged. She followed the case closely, trying to unpack how a perfect storm of people and circumstances culminated in the death of innocents. Now, her new book, Children of Darkness and Light, out now from Pegasus Crime, draws on her professional expertise, expansive investigation, and personal interviews to shed light on the darkest corners of a story that began with doomsday prophecies and ended in an all-too-real horror, according to the book's synopsis. Here is an exclusive excerpt that lays out how Lori Daybell started to go so wrong. The town of Rexburg, Idaho is unlikely to attract national attention for any reason, let alone as the epicenter for a conservative religious movement that spawned a notorious murder case. Rexburg calls itself America's family community. It's a quiet little farm town where the crime rate is low and murders are nearly non-existent. Lori Vallow expected her move to Rexburg to be a fresh start for her and her children, Tylee 16 and JJ 7, but trouble seemed to follow her. People who knew Lori Cox Yane's LaGoya Ryan Vallow said she was magnetic. If Lori was your friend, prepare for some serious love bombing because she stuck to her friends like Velcro. She was bubbly and generous and loved entertaining. Before her move to Rexburg, she lived in the expansive home her estranged fourth husband, Charles Vallow, rented for her after their final separation. The beautiful residence was built in the Mediterranean style, popular in the affluent suburbs around Phoenix, Arizona. A home reflects the people who live there, and Lori's upscale rental in Chandler, Arizona was no exception. It was outwardly gracious while inwardly a little odd. The backyard patio and pool were beautiful. Any room visitors might see was furnished like a model home, except for the empty, mirror-lined living room where Lori danced on wood floors to Christian and 80s rock music for hours every day. Lori's bedroom was tidy. The bed was neatly made with a pretty comforter and nothing was out of place. In contrast, her children's rooms looked like an afterthought. Neither of the children had furniture, just a single unmade mattress tossed on the floor. Clothing and toys littered the remaining floor space. Barely a month before her move to idyllic Rexburg, Lori's fourth husband, Charles, had been shot to death in the mirrored living room of that Chandler, Arizona home by Lori's brother, Alex Cox. Alex, who later moved to Rexburg with Lori, claimed Charles threatened him with a baseball bat, so he fired 2 shots into Charles' chest in self-defense. Lori didn't tell anyone where she was going when she left Arizona 3 weeks later. Even Colby Ryan, her adult son from her second marriage, knew only that she was going somewhere cold. Charles Vallow was a successful financial planner and a generous man who was happy to help his extended family. Before he died, he was paying for cell phones and auto insurance for most of Lori's family, including her parents. He was also helping support Colby, who had recently married and had his first child. Charles liked being a family man. He'd been the one to approach his sister, Kay Woodcock, about adopting her grandson, Canaan. When Lori and Charles finalized the adoption, Canaan was a year old. They changed his name to Joshua Jackson Vallow. The family called him JJ. JJ was diagnosed on the autism spectrum and also had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which meant he was highly energetic, easily overwhelmed, and prone to emotional meltdowns that required much patient attention. The Woodcocks were convinced Lori was the right mom for the job. Few who knew Lori Vallow then would have recognized that she was struggling. On the outside, she was the same bubbly, blonde mom she had always been, but inside she was seething. Only those closest to her noticed. Lori and her third husband, Joe Ryan, had been fighting over Tylee's custody since they divorced when Tylee was a baby, and their emotionally and financially draining custody and visitation disputes continued unabated. Tylee, who had always been Lori's sweet little girl, became a sarcastic, bitter, and often surly teenager. JJ required constant attention, and persistent money problems meant Charles was no help because he worked more than he was home. Nothing seemed to fill the emptiness, and Lori escaped more and more into books. She liked romantic young adult novels, but also began reading more books with a Mormon doomsday theme. Lori's friends and family say that although she had always been interested in end-time theology, it was around this time that her interest in near-death experiences and apocalyptic prophecies became obsessive. She started listening to doomsday podcasts and reading religious books, searching for a deeper spiritual connection. Family members say she read The Second Comforter, Conversing with the Lord Through the Veil by Denver Snuffer Jr. Snuffer is a lawyer who lives in Utah and was excommunicated from the LDS Church in 2013 for apostasy. He leads a group called the Remnant Movement. Snuffer believes the mainstream LDS Church is itself in apostasy and must be returned to faithfulness. The mainstream church teaches that only men are endowed with priesthood power. Snuffer wrote, "It is not required that you have the priesthood to receive the Second Comforter. Everyone is invited to come to him. The promises he made are clearly directed at both men and women. God is no respecter of persons and is universally willing to accept all who come unto him." According to Snuffer, the Second Comforter is Jesus Christ, who appears in person to each seeker. The idea that Jesus can personally appear to anyone is antithetical to mainstream LDS Church teachings. Lori, having been raised within the patriarchal framework of the LDS Church, where men control nearly everything, including one's connection to the divine, must have found the idea that a woman could have an intimate relationship with a living and present Jesus Christ hard to resist. It was a vulnerability that Chad Daybell, Lori's prophet and fifth husband, would exploit. Lori continued to find comfort and distraction in young adult fiction. She read the entire Twilight series by LDS author Stephanie Meyer several times. The books appealed to Lori's naive view of romantic relationships. She also discovered books by Chad Daybell, which mixed fanciful ideas like time travel with long-held LDS beliefs. It was a potent combination for someone like Lori. The stories made an even more profound impression on Lori when Chad announced that the books were not wholly fiction, but had been inspired by his religious visions. Chad became a larger-than-life figure for Lori. Lori's interest in the end times wasn't new, but her obsession with it was. Her son, Colby, remembered his mother talking about how the end was coming soon when he was about 10 or 11. Although Lori had been studying near-death experiences and reading doomsday books since 2012, her downward spiral began in earnest a few weeks after Lori first met Melanie Gibb in 2018. Not long after their move to Arizona, Lori met a friend named Melanie Gibb who shared her doomsday views. They met at a class where Melanie taught a group of women about food storage and other end-of-time survival strategies. Their connection was instantaneous, and Lori began her signature love bombing. Lori and Melanie started seeing one another several times a week and often met at the LDS Temple in Mesa, Arizona for prayer and ancestry work. They were both devout in their LDS faith, interested in the end times, and each had a son with ADHD and autism. Melanie loved Lori, but she was not impressed with Lori's children. JJ was a demanding, uninhibited, and sometimes destructive 7-year-old, and Tylee was a bitter, angry teenager with a perpetual chip on her shoulder. Colby had moved out and married his pregnant girlfriend after a failed attempt at an LDS mission. All young Mormon men are expected to serve. Lori seemed to float above all the dysfunction like the proverbial swan, gliding gracefully on the surface while furiously paddling underneath. In an early selfie, Lori and Melanie could be sisters. Lori, the pretty cheerleader, and Melanie, an academic, less flashy sibling. By the time Melanie Gibb self-published a book titled Feel the Fire in 2019, she was firmly in Lori's orbit. Melanie Gibb would also enter the crowded Boise courtroom 4 years later to testify against her best friend. Charles and Lori's 14-year marriage was Lori's longest, and friends and family members said they appeared happy until Lori began flirting with the offbeat neo-fundamentalist religious ideas of Chad Daybell and others. Lori accompanied Melanie and several other women on a road trip from Phoenix, Arizona to St. George, Utah to attend the October conference of Preparing a People. During their 7-hour drive, the women talked nearly continuously as they got to know each other. Melanie knew Lori was enamored with Chad Daybell's books and that Chad Daybell was speaking at the event. Melanie had met Chad at earlier PAP conferences and looked forward to introducing Lori to him. She couldn't know she would be starting the equivalent of a nuclear chain reaction that, when finally spent, would cost the lives of at least 5 people. When Lori and Melanie arrived at the conference, they found Chad at a vendor table selling his books. Melanie introduced him to Lori and later described the moment as electric. Lori and Chad began talking nonstop about their ideas. Lori had already stumbled upon the doctrine of multiple mortal probations, a form of reincarnation, so she was enchanted when Chad told her they'd been married to one another in a previous life. Lori spent most of her weekend helping Chad sell his books. Chad told her he believed she was a goddess, an exalted being whom God had placed on earth to begin preparation for the end times. He had seen and visioned that together they would gather and lead the 144,000 of God's chosen and usher in the new millennium. They were together nonstop and arranged to meet again in a few weeks when Chad was scheduled to speak at a Preparing a People event near Lori's home in Arizona. As Lori drove home from Utah, in her mind, God seemed to affirm everything she had been learning. I have already read When the Moon Turns to Blood by Leah Satili, which is a great book about this same sequence of events, but that doesn't mean I don't want to read this one also. As a reminder, it's called Children of Darkness and Light and is written by Lori Hellis. To finish up today, we will go to this little graphic that says, "Normalize comforting people without mentioning God." While that may be a comforting thing for you, it isn't for everyone. And that's your update for today, folks. I absolutely hope you have the day that you deserve.